Welcome to another episode of Judge for Yourself. In today's show, I want to reflect on gender equality and women's rights in South Africa. It's said that only 28% of senior management positions are filled by women in South Africa. Pay differences by men and women is approximately at 35%. And then when we get to questions of rape and domestic violence, it is absolutely outrageous that South Africa remains off the seismograph in relation to these questions. So how far have we come in ensuring that we have vindicated the constitutional commitment to gender equality, which is enshrined there? To what extent is it central, not just to the agenda of government, but also to the private sector? These are really important questions. Perhaps the most important is, have we moved away from the patriarchal society that arguably we inherited as a result of 300 years of racist and sexist rule? These are questions which are terribly important. And if you'd like to join this discussion, please use the Twitter hashtag JFYWomen. Now, to join us, we are joined by Joy Watson, feminist researcher, Rebecca Davis, journalist and author, who writes often on issues of gender, particularly, I understand, for the Daily Maverick. And in Johannesburg, we have Jacqui Mofokeng, head of the Progressive Women's Movement and spokesperson for the ANC's Women's League in Gauteng. Jacqui, let me start with you. I'm curious as to, I saw the ANC's Women's League taking considerable exception to a piece written in the Mail and Guardian, suggesting that the Women's League wasn't doing enough to kind of address the endemic problems of patriarchy. And I'd be interested in your comment on that.
I think the Minister Edna Molewa responded to that as a spokesperson for the ANC Women's League at National. And we thought that we have exhausted the fact that, understanding that we know that we are in a patriarchal society, we have liberated women, and we are saying now is their chance to liberate themselves. Because women must start in their homes, in their churches, and even at work, that they must start to fight patriarchy.
But can I just ask you this? I mean, I couldn't help but, and I can't help but ask you this. Just last week, in the presidential question time, a young DA woman, I'm not sure, she seemed young to me, got up, asked a question, seemed a perfectly sensible question, and the president said Tomazana, I think, which means a young woman, instead of honourable member. Exception was taken to that. Surely that's wrong. Surely he wouldn't do that with a man.
As I was listening to the debate, I know that I'm in the Gauteng legislature, and I did watch. The president did apologize, and I'm sure that from now on they'll be accepted to be called honorable members. Remember, these are things that you're saying that maybe they come with patriarchy, and we did actually say that we acknowledge that, and maybe it was a mistake.
Well, that's the point. I mean, isn't that, I mean, it's astounding the extent to which patriarchy seems to still get replicated. I was at a seminar yesterday, on Friday, and we were talking about these particular questions. The papers were given, and a woman relayed how, DJ, I'm not going to mention the DJ on some radio station I certainly don't listen to, and how they were talking about sort of sex and, sort of chuckling away about sort of, male complaints in a most extraordinarily sexist way. Why is it that our society remains so stuck in the mud in these particular questions?
I mean, it's a million-rand question, Judge. And obviously South Africa is not alone here. All over the world we see problems with, for instance, female representation in politics. In fact, South Africa is doing relatively well on that scale compared to other developed countries like the UK and the US. Why is our society still so sexist? I mean, why are there 3 women on this panel discussing gender? It's because that's because it's considered a women's issue still, even though women are the only people. Yeah, we've got one male.
That's me. So,
women are the only people who are not able to, in fact, systematically, socially uplift women because they generally aren't in control. And while I hear what Jacqui's saying there about women taking the charge and uplifting themselves, I mean, I think that often it just isn't that simple for women to be responsible for their own empowerment when there are very real, practical blocks to their progress at many levels of society.
Well, how do you respond to this? I mean, it does seem to me that we haven't done particularly well on gender. We've done much better on race.
I think what is interesting for me is that if one looks at the trajectory post-94, and as Rebecca has said, I think we've done well, there have been gains made, and I think that some of those gains were fought for by the Women's National Coalition. So there were feminists in civil society, feminists who then migrated to the state, who worked very hard to fight for a particular set of, for example, national gender machinery. And I think that part of the problem is that there was this reliance that once there would be the set of state institutions that would take up the issue of promoting gender equity, that we had solved the puzzle. And 20 years down the line, we're in a space where we have to look at the gender machinery and say, you know, there have been some very uneven successes. There have been moments when different parts of the structure have been in disarray. In 2006, for example, we saw all the Commission for Gender Equality commissioners resigning because of internal dissent. In 2007, we had the Office and the Status of Women dysfunctional. And so, you know, it's time to sit back and...
question. I was always curious as to why we had to have a gender commission as opposed to a human rights commission, which could have dealt with gender questions.
I think that the thinking at the time of the...
This is kind of binary opposition. I was curious about it.
The thinking at the time of the Women's National Coalition was that there would be a set of structures where you would have an independent statutory body in the form of the Gender Commission, and you'd have a structure within the executive being the Office on the Status of Women, which is now being replaced by the Ministry. And then you would have something within the legislature. So it was envisaged as a comprehensive set of institutional structures. And the question now becomes, to what extent have they delivered or not? And in some ways, you know, one has to look at also how they've been set up, you know, in the face of the resource allocations given to the... So the Human Rights Commission, for example, is given more funding than the Gender Commission. If you look at the Department of Women in the presidency, it has by far the smallest budget.
And why should we have a Department of Women, for goodness sake? Why aren't these questions... why aren't these questions so deeply imbricated into the thinking of every single department?
Well, I think that that's a very good question, because in some ways the reliance has been on this set of institutional structures within the state. And the reality is that there's been uneven successes, and they've
I think
not
at one
been...
point it was women and disabilities, if I recall correctly.
Women, children, and persons
Am I right?
with disabilities. That's
Yes,
correct. It's changed now, yes.
Well, that said everything.
And the reality is that as much as, you know, to actually be fair, that they started out with very serious set of intentions, and they started out embarking on very serious public consultation exercises, and there have been gains that they've made. So, for example, we see some very progressive pieces of legislation that were fought for by, for example, the committee in Parliament. However, you know, we're having to sit back and take stock now and say, to what extent have we relied on the state, and notwithstanding the fact
The state, okay, I got your point. I want to come back to that, but I have to take a break, and then we'll return.